Good evening, everyone, and welcome. This is Mishnah in Depth, Eduyot, where we have the pleasure of learning for the past couple of weeks with Dr. Yitz Landes. Mishnah in Depth is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and sponsored by her family in her memory. This class is working with the standard Mishnah Yomit daily study schedule and is assuming that you are learning 1 to 2 mishnayot on your own, and we are going to come together once a week to review, look at things more in depth, poke at interesting concepts, and all within the context of a collaborative community. And it's been a pleasure learning with Dr. Landes, who is currently an assistant professor at JTS. And with that, I want to hand things over to him.
Great. Thank you for that, Kayla. So I am once again going to share my screen. So for today, I'm basically going to be reading through a lot of the mishnayot from chapter 3 and into the beginning of chapter 4. I know that, I guess by the way the cycle works, we're actually already in the middle of chapter 3, but I think it kind of helps to go back to the beginning of the chapter and look at it all as one unit because as I mentioned in the past, chapters really are the main building blocks of the Mishnah, even more than individual mishnayot are. And so it's helpful to kind of see the entire thrust of the chapter in one fell swoop. And then hopefully also we'll be able to get into the beginning of chapter 4 as well. And then next week we could continue into chapter 4 and really look at that as a whole. So just an overview of both the chapters, at least of the third and beginning of the fourth. So we start off with 10 disputes between Rabbi Yosef ben Horkanus and the sages. We have debates after that if something is pure or not, largely revolving on the question of what is considered actually a vessel in order to contract impurity. We have traditions relating to Rabban Gamliel and 3 things that Elazar ben Azariah permits and the sages forbid. So really keeping within the period of Yavna in this chapter. Yosef ben Horkanus, one of the older sages in the Yavna generation. And then moving on to some of the later stages. And then in chapter 4, this is a very, very, very famous chapter. It appears as an idea in various parts of rabbinic literature, cases in which Beit Shammai was more lenient than Beit Hillel. And in talking about the first of these 2 chapters in chapter 3, I will pause once or twice to talk about parallels between the material in this part of the chapter and this chapter and elsewhere in the Mishnah, thinking back to that question that we have around, well, is Eduyot a collection of sayings that appear elsewhere, or is Eduyot a source for other parts of the Mishnah? And if it is the latter, if it is a source for other parts of the Mishnah, does that mean that Eduyot really is this earlier tractate upon which other tractates are based? Is it an early attempt at organizing rabbinic knowledge? And again, we are constantly seeing how it is so different than other tractates, and the knowledge really is organized here differently, not exactly by topic, but rather by trade-ins, by sages, by specific kinds of arguments, and specific kinds of other things relating to who said what to whom. I should say off the bat that we will see a bunch of parallels between this chapter and other parts, and we'll look at that as we get closer. But first we have to just kind of understand these actually quite difficult mishnayot on their own. So let's start off. We have כל מטמין באוהל שנחלקו, הכניסן לתוך הבית, ודוסה בן הלקנס מטהר, וחכמים תמיד. So the large issue kind of hovering around the debate here is whether different things which can contract, which could pass on, different impure things can join together in order to make that house or that person impure, right? So only things that actually could contract impurity through being covered in a tent are actually parts of a dead body, not of an animal, but of a human. So if these different parts of the body separate, but they came into the house at the same time, if it is enough to contract impurity or not, Rabbi Dosa says that this is not going to actually make the house impure, whereas the Chachamim do think that it does that. They actually can join together. Now let's get into it more in depth, although talking about other kinds of things. כיצד? הנוגע בכשני חצאי זיתים מן הנבלה, או נושאן, right? So if one has 2 olive size portions, sorry, 2 half olives, that is size portions of a dead animal, and carries it, right? This actually cannot contract impurity through what's called tent impurity, but rather just by being touched, or if a dead body, if someone has two halves of an olive size amount of them, and then there is a tent over them on half of a zayit, or if one then also touches a half olive size worth of that, and then another half olive size is over the other half, is a tent is over the other half olive size, I should say that. Basically, the idea is here that I'll just finish reading the Hebrew and then I'll explain it because again, this is going to be the most complicated Mishnah we're going to read today. הנוגע בחצי זית ומאהיל על כחצי זית, או נוגע בכחצי זית וחצי זית ומאהיל עליו, ומאהיל על כשני חצאי זיתים, מאהיל על כחצי זית וכחצי זית מאהיל עליו, Eduyot ben Hilkanos metaher v'chachamim metamim. Essentially, what happens is that we have different kinds of ways to passing on that impurity, right? You could be holding half of an olive's size worth, or you can be having half of an olive size worth that is being tented over. So those two things at the same time, it means that we need to have an entire olive size amount of the dead matter in order to contract the impurity, and has to be happening in the same fashion. So according to Rabbi Yosef ben Horkness, it has to be in the same fashion. It has to be both of them kind of being tented over, or both of them being touched or passed by. Whereas Chachamim say that actually this could contract impurity even if you have different kinds of ways of transmitting that impurity happening at the same time. In that case, they can join together. Extremely esoteric thing. Does appear elsewhere in the Mishnah. But let's get into the next thing. אבל הנוגע בחצי זית ודבר אחר, מאהיל עליו ועל כחצי זית, או מאהיל על כחצי זית ודבר אחר מאהיל עליו ועל כחצי זית, טהור. אמר רבי מאיר, אף בזה רבי יוסף מטהר וחכמים מטמאים. הכל טמא חוץ מן המגע עם המסע והמסע עם האוהל. זה הכלל, כל שהוא משם אחד טמא, משני שמות, טהור. The Meir says, even in this case though, הנוגע בחצי זית ודבר אחר מאהיל עליו על כחצי זית. If someone is touching the half of the olive size amount, and something else is tented over it, and also over the half zayit, or is tenting over the half zayit and something else is tenting over the other half, then it doesn't work at all, right? So in that case, even though it is the same kind of passing on of impurity, someone would say that, Rabbi Dosa would say that actually it is tahor. But actually, according to Rabbi Meir, in this case, this would contract impurity. This actually is a disagreement between Rabbi Dosa and the Chachamim. And then we go back to the anonymous Mishnah or Rabbi Meir. That it actually has to be the same kind of thing. Everything can contract impurity unless you are doing it in two different fashions at the same time. As long as there are two kinds of tenting or two kinds of touching, even if it's not happening at the same moment, or sorry, at the same time, but not at the same portion. Mishnah Shemot Tohor. But if it is contracting, if you are using both the tent and also the touching, therefore that would still be pure. Probably didn't explain that the best. We can come back to it. But the idea is here that Yosef ben Horkness is more lenient than the Chachamim, specifically because he does not think that one can join these different kinds of methods of transmitting impurity to the same extent that the sages do think that one can actually, or should, or must combine and count for these two kinds of transmitting impurity at the same time, in a case in which the dead matter does not equal an olive-sized amount of dead matter unless we join the two together. Extremely unlikely situation to ever happen, but it gets down to this kind of the argument over how we think about joining different aspects of passing on impurity. Okay. Ochel parud eno mitztaref, divrei Rabbi Yosef ben Hilkanos. Chachamim omrim mitztaref. Right. So if food is now in separate pieces, according to Yosef ben Hilkanos, we do not consider this to be one item of food, and therefore we do not think that it can become impure. But the sages do say that it does join together and therefore contract impurity. So we're done now with the aspects of impurity, specifically around how something can contract impurity or not. And he then switches to a different aspect, another thing that they argue about. Machalin maser sheni al asimon divrei Rabbi Dosa. If one has produce of the second year that they need to bring to Jerusalem, but they cannot pass it all, they cannot bring it all with them to Jerusalem, and therefore they want to exchange it for coins. According to Rabbi Dosa, that coin does not actually have to have an image imprinted on the coin. It could just be some kind of coin which seems to have not exactly gone through a mint entirely, but it is coin-like enough in order for it to be transferred the holiness from the produce to the coin and then brought to Jerusalem to purchase food items there. This is not coin-like enough for the purposes of Maaser Sheni. Going back to purity, but a bit of a different case. So according to Rabbi Dosa, if one has a certain kind of lower form of impurity, all they have to do in order to deal with the chatat, which in this case refers specifically to the parat tuma, the red heifer, and preparing the red heifer for its use in order to purify others, they only need to wash their hands. If one's hands become impure, it is as if for this purpose that their entirety became impure, and then they actually have to go to the mikvah. More Rabbi Dosa, me'e avatiach uknivat yerek shel tuma. Rabbi Dosa matil lezalim v'chachamim osrin. The parts of the fruit or the vegetable that actually aren't usually eaten, so it seems like it's the seeds or maybe it's like the water inside a melon, and some kind of part of the, I guess, upper, what is it? I guess like the leaves of the vegetable, which all could have been part of truma. According to Rabbi Dosa, this actually doesn't contain the holiness of truma, and therefore anyone could eat it. But according to the sages, it is entirely still holy, and therefore only allowed for the priests. Totally different area. Of halachana chamesh rechelot kezuzot mane mane ufras. If there are 5 different what's the word? An U? I never know how to pronounce that. EWE.
You, I
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah, you. That ends up making this much fleece if they are shorn, right? Is that the word? You short? I don't know. Or you take a.
Yep, that the English term is to shear, to cut off the
Shear, right? If anyone shears the sheep, in this case the female sheep, according to Rabbi Dosa, this is enough. But this actually is a leniency because according to the sages, no matter how much wool they provide, no matter what it is, they already have to are obligated in Rishit Hagez, and also for that to be given to the priest. So widely different areas of halacha, and we'll see a few more cases of this. Again, this is jumping back and forth, and we said there are 9 different examples here of their disagreement between the sages and Rabbi Yosef ben Hyrcanus. Again, this early sage who seems to even have some traditions from the time of the Second Temple, and is in these cases all more lenient than the sages themselves. Any kind of mat can contract impurity from the dead, according to Rabbi Dosa. And this is also leniency because Chachamim omrim midras, that they could also contract the impurity of a midras, which is if a zav either deals with it, lies on it, or stands on it, that also could contract a specific kind of impurity. Yeah, I guess that's enough of that. Yeah. כל הכליות טהורות, חוץ משל גל גילון, דברי רבי דוסה. וחכמים אומרים כולם טמאות, חוץ משל צמרים. הכליות, לקלוע, you might be familiar with that term also from modern Hebrew, is to braid something. So this is kind of like, I guess, a braid of some sort or a network, something that someone might wear but isn't exactly an article of clothing. It could be more like something that they put on them to hold something or something like that. According to Rabbi Dosa, they are generally speaking all cannot contract impurity because they are not vessel enough they're not a vessel like enough in order to contract impurity. Except for that of a galgilon, which I guess is a girdle, right? So it's a specific kind of cord or braided item that someone would wear, which actually really is an article of clothing and therefore can contract impurity. The sages say that all of them can contract impurity, except for those used by a wool, someone who works with wool. Tzamal, tzemer is wool, so someone who actually works with creating wool which I guess is sort of something which is actually used to carry wool. And therefore it's a vessel, but not vessel-like enough, according to the sages, in order for it to contract impurity. Again, as you can tell, it is all over the place with these arguments, although we do seem to be dealing primarily with issues of impurity and purity from all different parts of those debates about purity and impurity and those different halachot about purity and impurity. And also with that, some things which do have to do specifically with priestly tithes or tithing in general. So we are in, although it's a wide array of areas of halacha, it is within the general kind of parts of the Mishnah, we might say. Like it generally is really having to do with things of purity or with priestly gifts, things which we would say nowadays are not, for the most part, quite relevant anymore. Or if they are relevant, it's not things that have to do with like immediate day-to-day. It's not nizikin, and we'll see in a moment. For the most part, though, it isn't necessarily about things that have to do with family life. הכלא שבית קיבול שלה הרוג טמאה, ושלו רבי דוסה בן חלקנס מטהר וחכמים מטמאים. Ekela. Here too, you might actually hear the modern Hebrew word likla is like to score, to hit something, or to shoot something. And so the kela is a slingshot. And if it's, I guess, like pocket of it is knit or woven, it can actually contract impurity. But if it is leather, Eduyot ben Horkanus says that it is pure, and the Chachamim say that it can become impure. And this has to do with specificities of leather contracting impurity, which is a bit different. And it has to be a specific size. It has to be more vessel-like in order for it to contract that. And Eduyot ben Horkanus does not think that it gets to that level of vessel in order for it to become impure. Nifsak beit etzba shela tehora. If part of the slingshot had broke, then it's no longer a vessel and it is impure. It is pure and not impure. But if specifically, I guess this is the part that kind of joins together the part that you hold and the part that you pull back. It can still be used even if that is broken. So therefore, it is still a vessel and it could become impure, again, according to the Chachamim, in cases in which it, basically in all cases, but in Rabbi Dosa, it's really only if it's a woven one. And now we get to something actually which I mentioned that we will get to is specifically having to do a bit more with family life, but also here too, this has to do largely with issues that relate to the priests and tithes. So Hashvua Uchelet Batuma, Divrei Rabbi Dosa. A woman who had been taken captive, she does eat from the truma according to Rabbi Dosa. And why wouldn't she eat from the truma? Because the thinking is that perhaps when she was in captivity, she might have been raped, and a woman who has had sexual relations outside of marriage can no longer have truma. The Chachamim omrim yesh shvua ochelet v'yesh shvua ena ochelet. Right, so the sages say that actually there are ones who do eat and there are ones who don't eat. So Rabbi Dosa seems to not assume that she had been raped. The sages say that there are some who do, and there are some who we actually we unfortunately assume that they are no longer able to eat truma. Ketzad. Aisha shamra nishbeti utehora ani ochelet she'apesha asar hu apesha hitir. And how could this possibly be? A woman who testifies about herself that she was taken captive, but also says that she is pure, she is allowed to eat, because the mouth that forbid is the mouth that permits. Right? Otherwise, we wouldn't know that she was taken captive. And so why would she tell us that she was taken captive? Why would we even believe her in the first place? Why would she offer to tell us that information when she could just not have told us that, and therefore would have been able to continue to eating tuma? So given that she says part of the things, and seems to be somewhat self-incriminating in this regard, not that it's her fault at all, but that it adds information that one did not know beforehand and did not suspect her of being unable to eat truma. Therefore, we believe her. Therefore, the Chachamim say that she is believed, and therefore she can continue to eat truma. But if there are witnesses to the fact that she was taken captive, and she says, given that we no longer have this principle of pesha asar or pesha etio, the mouth that forbade is the mouth that permitted, there is, unfortunately, she cannot, the Chachamim say that she's not trusted, and therefore she can no longer eat truma. So obviously, absolutely tragic Mishnah to kind of just like end with there. But it's something which also becomes like a halachic principle, pesha asar pesha etio, and this is this halachic principle, which is learned also in other parts of other cases. So, ending these 9 different disagreements, in which case Dos Ben Hyrcanus is the more lenient, we get to this place of being, well, on the one hand, we think to ourselves, this is totally random. This seems to be a totally random assortment of halachot, like much of Eduyot is. And we have to ask ourselves after finishing the unit, well, is it original to Eduyot, right? And this might seem again like a question which this could be a question of the Talmud scholars of how we're constantly interested in this. What's earlier, what's later, is Eduyot or another text, but it is helpful because it gets us thinking again about this question of, well, what did rabbinic discourse look like in this early stage in the end of the 1st century in Yavna? So I mentioned a few times already the dissertation of Rabbi Jeremy Wieder on Tractate Eduyot, and I'll just read the summary of his discussion of this section. So not all of these discussions here actually have parallels. And so if there's no parallel elsewhere in the Mishnah, we could just assume that, well, it's original to this section. But when there are parallels to another part of the Mishnah, that's when we have the question of whether it's original to there, original to here, or original to some other third source, unknown source. And then it got to both Eduyot and to the parallels. So the first half of the chapter is comprised of 10 debates, sorry, I said 9 earlier, between Rabbi Dosa and the sages. 4 are not found elsewhere in the Mishnah in any form and must be original to Mishnah Eduyot. 3 more of them lack Rabbi Dosa's opinion in the parallel Mishnah. Right, so even this one appears in Tractate Ketubot, but without Rabbi Dosa's opinion in it. So 3 of them are like that we have a parallel, but we don't have Rabbi Dosa's opinion there. So it couldn't have been that Mishnah Eduyot comes from there. And on the remaining 3, all of which do appear identically elsewhere in the Mishnah, he has demonstrated that 2 of them show clear signs of being secondary in the other locations in the Mishnah, and hence likely derived from Mishnah Eduyot. In one case is unclear. So we could think back to there having been some kind of collection or someone who said, let's try and think for ourselves of all the cases in which Dosa ben Hyrcanus and the sages disagree, and Dosa ben Hyrcanus is more lenient. It was some kind of mnemonic. It was some kind of way of memorizing this important aspect of Dosa ben Hyrcanus's teachings. And he is someone who appears in various places in the Mishnah, mentioned the Talmuds as well. And then once that collection existed, and existed also in Tractate Eduyot, when studying those topics in another context, like when studying Masechet Ketubot, they said, oh, we should bring in part of this parallel, we should bring in the material that's relevant, even though there they allied Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus. But in Ohalot, when some of these things come up, then they brought it there as well. Now let's move on to the second half of the chapter. And we begin with Ablas Vekot Rabbi Yeshua Metameh, Bechachamim Mitaharin. If beforehand the sages were the ones who were more stringent, now they are the ones who are more lenient. Ketzad. Hatameh omed b'hatahor over. Hatahor omed b'hatameh over. So if someone who is impure is standing and someone who is pure is passing by, or someone who is pure is standing and someone who is impure is passing by, Tuma b'reshut yachid v'tohara b'reshut harabim. If the impure person is in the reshut yachid and the pure person is in the public domain in reshut harabim, tzara b'reshut yachid v'tuma b'reshut harabim. If the pure person is in private space and the impure person is in reshut harabim, and there's a debate, safek naga, safek lo naga, whether he touched him or didn't touch him, safek il, safek lo il, whether it tented over that person or didn't tent over that person, safek yisit, safek lo yisit, if it caused that person to change the direction of their movement or whatever, or did not do that. In all these cases, Rabbi Yeshua mitameh, v'chachamim mitaharim. Part of it has to do with the question of safek tuma b'reshut harabim. So generally speaking, if there is a question about the passing on of impurity in reshut harabim, in a public domain, then impurity is not passed along. But here the problem is that one of the people is in reshut yachid, right? So one of them is in reshut harabim, one is in the public domain, and if they were both in the public domain, there probably wouldn't be a disagreement here. It's specifically because of this aspect of one person being in Rishut Yachid and one person being in Rishut Rabim that this very disagreement exists. That's a disagreement. And here too, we could ask the question, why is it here? This is again another early sage who could be important for thinking about this period, again in the history, in the story of like Yavna here. And it's also in the question of impurity and purity, which we have seen seems to have bothered them tremendously at this time. A similar kind of debate where again the sages seem to be the ones who are more lenient. מסמר השולחני ועלון של גרוסות, ומסמר של אבן שעות, רבי צדוק מטמא וחכמים מטהרים. Masmer Shulchani, this is a money changer. Masmer, I think it's the Rambam, who says that this is actually what they use to hold the scale at a money changing table. The Aron Shel Grusot, which actually not necessarily a nail, although some interpreters do think this also has to do with the nail, specifically of someone who makes, I guess, has something to do with preparing of grist, I think is the word, some kind of wheat item. Let me just look to see how Shai Cohen translates the word in the Oxford Annotated Mishnah. It is, yeah, a grist dealer's chest. That's how he translates it. Masmer shel Evan Sha'ot. So Evan Sha'ot is a sundial, literally a stone of hours. And so the I guess the pin or whatever they call it, the dial itself, which casts a shadow, Rabbi Tzadok thinks that all those things actually can contract impurity because they are vessel-like enough to become impure, whereas the sages say that no, they are not, and therefore they are tohol. Okay, so we had the section on Rabbi Yosef ben Horkonus. We had one Mishnah on Rabbi Yeshua, and then one Mishnah on Rabbi Tzadok, 4 and 3. And I'm going to go back to a list of 4. There are 4 things which Rabbi Gamliel says are impure, and the sages say cannot contract impurity. Kisui teni shel matachot shel ba'alev vatim. So the cover of some kind of metals, metal baskets of just general people, not people who necessarily work in the field of preparing metal. Utloi hamagredot, and this has to do, this also is a super hard thing to translate. I tried finding a way of doing it. He calls it here the hanger of a strigil. So utloi hamagredot is specifically used in the context of bathing in the Roman world. So it's not the brush itself, but rather the chain on the brush itself. And metal vessels that are not shaped yet, they're still golmi, they're still unformed. And a table that was broken into 2. So all these things, Rabbi Gamliel thinks, are vessels already, and therefore could contract impurity, where the sages say that they are not vessels and therefore cannot contract impurity. But Modim Chachamim Rabbi Gamliel betavla shenechlaka l'shnayim. But they do agree with Rabbi Gamliel in the case in which a table was broken into 2. A plate, not a table. A plate was broken into 2. If one half, not half, one part of it is much bigger than the other, the big part of the plate becomes impure if it can become impure, because it's still big enough to be used as a vessel, whereas the small part cannot be used as a vessel and therefore does not contract impurity. So again, the thinking is, what constitutes a vessel? We don't always know what the context or what the real reason behind this is. Just seems like some people are more strict than others. They could theoretically think of cases in which these items might be used for something, and therefore they are vessels. Whereas in the last case with the plate, we actually really do get a sense of what thinking is. I guess Ibn Gamliel thinks that even if they're cut in half or it's broken in half and it's still somewhat usable, they still are somewhat usable and therefore can contract impurity. Whereas the sages say it really has to be a big chunk of plate in order for it to be a vessel and therefore to become impure. So Rabbi Gamliel machmir divrei Beit Shammai. And this is surprising, but we see that Rabban Gamliel actually sides with Beit Shammai times. Usually, right, the halacha is that it's not like Beit Shammai. And here the thinking is actually that also we already see this idea that generally Beit Shammai actually are more stringent. And Rabban Gamliel, at 3 different occasions, actually decides to agree with them. And Tomlin Tachamin Miyom Tov l'Shabbat. One cannot actually prepare a chamin, put down something which will be continuing to be cooked into Shabbat from Yom Tov on the Shabbat. This has to do with kind of the idea, the legal fiction of the Erev Tavshilin, the different ways in which one can actually get around the issue of preparing from Yom Tov onto Shabbat. So this form of cooking, he actually does not think is legitimate. Beit Shammai in general are much more stringent on preparing food from Yom Tov to Shabbat. One also cannot fix the lamp on Yom Tov, something which Beit Hillel permits. And one does not bake really big loaves on Yom Tov, but rather only wafer-like ones, small ones. And why is that? Because one only can cook on Yom Tov for Yom Tov, right? We have this hack, this legal fiction, which allows us to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbat. But generally speaking, what you make has to be for the holiday. And if one is making these big loaves, that seems like they're actually making something not just for the holiday, but also for after the holiday. Amar Rabban Gamliel. Actually, this is what it was like in our house, right? The famed family of the Nesiim, that we did not make big loaves, but rather just small ones. And he seems to bring this as proof in the Beit Midrash that this should be the halacha. Amrulo, mana asel levet avicha, shayu machmorin al atzman umikilina Yisrael liot ofin pitin gritzin v'chori. So actually, I guess the sages or whoever's there, it's anonymous, responds to them by saying, actually, what can we do about it? I mean, your father was stringent about their own home, but they saw the difficulty of that this could be how this could raise for other people in the people of Israel, and they actually explicitly permitted them to bake large loaves, and even to make choli, some kind of like charcoal roasted loaf, which seemingly would have been more difficult to do in Yom Tov, and also seemingly would have been creating a large amount, which might also therefore have been eaten not on Yom Tov itself. Of course, the baking of bread was something entirely different than it is today. Important to remember that. And then the thing, I guess, that they wouldn't necessarily do it all the time, not every given moment, but it's hard to like so significantly change the manner in which one would prepare it between Yom Tov and another day. But although he is stringent like Beit Shammai on these occasions, there are moments actually when he is more permissible. You could actually on the festivals sweep between the couches. It looks like beds, but people would recline. And it's tricky to sweep on Shabbat, for example, because one might, I guess, get some things in between the boards, and then it's kind of like you're building on Shabbat if you're sweeping in that manner. But he says it's okay to do it on Yom Tov. And you could actually put some kind of like fragrance or spice on the coals on Yom Tov. And you could also roast a whole kid on Pesach, right? Which is something which was done in Jerusalem, but not something which was considered to be permissible to do by some outside of Jerusalem because it was too much like the Korban Pesach, and thus also the sages forbid it, right? They don't want people to be doing something that looks like a Korban Pesach on Pesach. They don't want people to be accidentally engage in building the house while sweeping on Yom Tov, or really using the fire for not cooking purposes exactly on Yom Tov. Okay, now we get to Rabban Gamliel's famous colleague, Elazar ben Azariah, famous colleague and sometimes opponent. So again, in the context of Yavna, and speaking about things that he permits but the sages forbid, similar to also the prior Mishnah where Rabban Gamliel permitted and the sages forbid. He let his cow go out on Shabbat, or obviously on Shabbat, with some strap between its horns. And one may, like, I guess, engage in this like very intense form of combing an animal on Yom Tov, which might create a blemish and therefore would be impermissible, but he allowed for it to happen. One could also grind pepper in the rechaim, which is, I guess, in its mill, rechaim. Here too, there seems to be an issue that it might be creating too much crushed pepper that one might not need necessarily just for Yom Tov, but also for outside Yom Tov, whereas it really should only be permissible to do it for Yom Tov itself. So these are all things which Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah allowed, but the sages did not allow. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, "Ein mekaldin de behema b'Yom Tov, mipnei shehu oseh chabura, aval mekal tzafin." So one cannot, I guess, use this is a metal type of comb on the animal on Yom Tov because it might create a wound, but one can use a wood one with a mekal. The verb there is mekal tzafin. Chachamim omrim, "Ein mekaldin af lo mekal tzafin." One cannot use this nor that. So they are more stringent than either of them. Wide array of halachot here, almost like a whirlwind tour through different areas of halacha. But largely, a lot of them end up having to do with Beitza, with Yom Tov, with halachot that have to do with Yom Tov in the end, some Shabbat as well. So actually, a lot of this does appear in Tractate Beitza, right? So Eduyot 3:9-11, the last three mishnayot of the chapter, also appears in Beitza 2:6-8. 9 cases are related to Shabbat festivals, 3 stringencies of Rabbi Gamliel, 3 leniencies of Rabbi Gamliel, and 3 debates between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and the sages. What do we think about that, though? Beitza is, generally speaking, about Yom Tov, about issues of Muktzah on Yom Tov and issues of Melacha on Yom Tov. The problem here is that not all of these are actually about that, right? Just, what was this? Last slide. What did we see here? The first one here has to do with Parato Yotza v'Rutzuah ben Karnel, right? This is specifically about carrying on Shabbat, not an issue in Yom Tov. So it doesn't all actually work in Beitza. So that alone should hint to us that it makes more sense for this to be an Eduyot, because while yes, a lot of this has to do with Yom Tov, the topic of Masachet Beitza, not all of it does. So this is what Rabbi Weider says. A cursory analysis indicates that the material was probably not formulated originally in the context of Beitza, because that tractate, generally speaking, deals with 2 major topics: the laws of Muktzah and the laws of Melacha. So the last case of Rabbi Gamliel's 3 leniencies has nothing to do with the laws of the festivals. Instead, it relates to the Askolem, right? The Gediya Mikulas that he permits to be prepared on the eve of Passover. And we saw the same thing also with Rabbi Elazar, right? The first Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's 3 cases is not related at all to festivals, but rather to Shabbat. The discussion of what an animal may wear in the public domain is found in the 5th chapter of Mishnah Shabbat and is found there in a different form. The issue of the 3rd case, combing out an animal's hair, applies to both Shabbat and festivals, and the Mishnah does say Yom Tov explicitly. And also, Rabbi Gamliel's 2nd stringency, Ein Zokvin to Menorah, has to do with Yom Tov, right? It says specifically the fixing of the Menorah on Yom Tov. In addition, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's last case, that of using the pepper mill on the festivals, belongs in the 1st chapter of Beitza, where the laws of grinding and festivals are discussed. So it's not only, it does relate to Yom Tov, but it's out of place in the 2nd chapter. It should have appeared in the prior chapter. All these points taken together indicate that the material was not originally formulated in the context of Mishnah Beitza. The editor of Mishnah Beitza inserted here the conclusion of the debates between the houses, which form the core of the first 2 chapters of Mishnah Beitza, because the first Mishnah speaks of Rabbi Gamliel adopting 3 stringencies of Beit Shammai. So we could see how, as Mishnah Beitza is talking about the opinions of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, it kind of got into this. It said, you know what? Oh, I know of, the editor said, I know of something else, generally speaking, on this topic, formulaically also somewhat similar, that's related to this place, which is this unit of text from Tractate Eduyot that begins with Rabbi Gamliel saying things that he disagrees with that he agrees with Beit Shammai about. So everybody goes to the conclusion that we assume that the Mishnah is original to Mishnah Eduyot. Okay. So now we see basically this entire chapter seems to be original here, and then copied elsewhere. We have the first chunk of it is Joseph ben Hyrcanus versus the Chachamim. Some of it's only known from here. Other parts of it are known from elsewhere, and we could assume that it was taken from here and adapted elsewhere. And then this unit here at the end of the chapter also just is just taken whole cloth, more or less, from Tractate Eduyot and put into Mishnah Beitza. Again, seeing that I think most evidence we have seen until now is bringing us to this place of saying this is an earlier tractate. It is something which material came from here and then was copied elsewhere in places where it was more relevant. I could take a deep breath, and then we'll, the time that remains, go on to the fourth chapter, but we could take a question. Any questions?
No questions in chat as of yet, but
Okay. Yeah.
people are entirely welcome to speak up and unmute themselves if they do.
Great. So chapter 4, as I mentioned earlier, is entirely on the cases in which Beit Shammai is more lenient than Beit Hillel. Interesting here too that it would be collected in this fashion. Interesting also to see that despite kind of the variety or the odd nature of the tractate, that there still is kind of this idea of the chapter as a unit and bringing together these materials in one chapter. So we're just going to introduce the material now, and then next week, once we see the rest of it, we could reflect more on the entirety of this chapter as a unit, and then these disagreements as a literary unit. אלה דברים מכולי בית שמאי ומחומרי בית הלל. בית אשר נולדה ביום טוב, בית שמאי אומרים תאכל, ובית הלל אומרים לא תאכל. So if an egg is born on Yom Tov, Beit Shammai says actually it can be eaten, whereas Beit Hillel says it can't be eaten because it is muktzeh. They don't use the word, but the thinking is that it didn't exist as the Yom Tov started, and therefore it cannot be used now. Whereas Beit Shammai says actually it kind of did exist because it was inside the chicken, and we could have killed the chicken on Yom Tov and then eaten it. Beit Shammai omrim so that yeast, just a olive's amount of it, and leavened food, chametz, as much as a date, that's enough on Pesach to violate the commandment. So they are more stringent, specifically referring to chametz, that it's just an olive's amount and not a date. בהמה שנולדה ביום טוב, הכל מודים שהיא מותרת, והפרוח שיצא מן הביצה, הכל מודים שהוא אסור. Right, but everyone agrees on these things. Right, a behema can, if it was born on Yom Tov, it could be eaten already on Yom Tov, because it's not totally muktzah, because it existed inside its mother's womb, and if the mother could have been killed and eaten on Yom Tov, so too this also existed. But the afrach that came out of the egg, that's actually really a different kind of thing. And therefore, they both agree that it is forbidden. Hashochet chayav of b'yom tov. Beit Shammai omrim yachbor b'deker v'chaseh. So a beast, right? This has to do with an undomesticated animal that was killed on Yom Tov. Its blood needs to be covered in dirt, but the dirt itself is muktzah, right? Because the dirt hasn't been set aside, placed to be used. So they actually think that that's okay. Beit Shammai, you could still use it. Beit Hillel אומרים לא ישחוט אלא אם כן היה לו עפר מוכן. But Beit Hillel says no. Given that we don't have the dirt ready, then they shouldn't actually kill the animal. You can only kill the animal and cover its blood, undomesticated animal, if you actually already have the dirt ready to cover the blood. ומודים שאם שחט שיחבור בדקר ויכסה, ושאפר קירה מוכן. Right, and they agree though that if one did kill it and then they realized, oh man, I didn't set aside any dirt for covering the blood of this undomesticated animal that I killed, that they should therefore go out and do it and dig up the dirt and cover the blood with it. The thinking being that it is a biblical commandment to cover up the blood with dirt, whereas the issue of it being muktzeh is a rabbinic commandment, or rabbinic prohibition. And the biblical commandment of covering up the blood with dirt overrules the rabbinic commandment of not digging up the dirt. So the Mishnah says she'efel kira muchanhu. It's kind of like we call this asyndetic, right? When there's like a semicolon there, they didn't add the word and. But they also agree that the ashes of a stove also count as being prepared for the holiday, and I guess that could be used as well to cover up. Okay. So again, we're not going to finish all the disagreements, but we'll read one more slew of them, and that brings us up to the Mishnahs of today. And in the coming days, you'll read more of these disagreements between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, in cases in which Beit Shammai is more lenient. Beit Shammai omrim hevker la'aniyim hevker. If one says I am making this part of my field hefker, but only to the poor. Beit Shammai says that actually does count as hefker. Beit Hillel omrim eino hefker ad sheyufkar af la'ashirim kashmita. But Beit Hillel says you can't just make a portion, or you can't just make your produce or your field hefker. I forgot the word for hefker. Just permissible for all, but only to the poor. It has to be actually permissible for anyone. Thinking also here is that why would someone do such a thing, right? It's kind of a hack. Like if you, I guess the thinking is that one makes their field hefker. That's a way to kind of get around separating tithes from it. But then, of course, someone could just come and take the food from you, and anyone can come and take it. So it's a bit of a gamble. And so making it just hefker for the poor is kind of a way of kind of increasing the possibility that no one will take your stuff and you could get it for yourself. So Beit Shammai says that you could do that. That is their leniency, whereas Beit Hillel says one cannot do that, and therefore that is their stringency. Okay. Kol amarei hasadeh shel kav kav. If there are sheaves of a certain amount, i.e., each one is the size of a kav, ve'achad shel arba'a kabin, but there is one, there's one sheaf, which is singular, that is actually the size of arba'a kabin, u'shachachacho, and one forgot it. Beit Shammai says that is not considered shichacha. But Beit Hillel says that it is shichacha, right? This actually does count as shichacha. The thinking is that, generally speaking, 4 is enough for it, and so this is, the proper amount, or the proper size according to Beit Hillel. But because it is actually just one, which is larger, and not 4 separate ones, even though it's equal to being the same size as 4 separate ones, Beit Shammai is more lenient and says that this doesn't actually count as shichacha, meaning that the owner of the field still owns it, and it does not have to go to the poor who can then come and collect it. If someone forgot a sheaf next to a wall or to some kind of, I guess, stack of sheaves, or next to animals or next to utensils, and forgot it there, Beit Shammai says, eno shechacha. The fact that it was left near these other things, that's a sign that it wasn't truly forgotten. This actually is shechacha, and therefore the poor can take it. So Beit Shammai says that something that is near these other things, it seems that actually someone does plan or likely will come back and get it. They haven't fully forgotten it yet. It needs to be totally on its own with nothing around it, in order for it to be considered truly forgotten, and therefore also the property of the poor. Kerem Revad, right? So this is an interesting halachic category. This is specifically a vineyard in its 4th year. Beit Shammai omrim eno chomesh ve'eno vi'ol. So the question is, what is the status of this produce? Generally speaking, it is like Maaser Sheni. It's like the second tithe. It needs to be eaten in Jerusalem or transferred into some kind of monetary form and then brought to Jerusalem, and then used to purchase food there. But when it has that transfer into money, into currency, you have to add a 5th of its amount, right? It is lesser than eating the food itself in Jerusalem, and so therefore you have to add more monetary value to it. And another thing you have to do is that if it's still around before Pesach, you have to destroy it. You can't eat it anymore; it has to be destroyed. Beit Shammai says that the Kerem Revai, the vineyard of the 4th year, is like Maaser Sheni, but only to an extent. That is, one does not need to add a 5th to its value if they want to exchange it for money and then bring that money to Jerusalem and use it there to buy food. And also, it does not need to be burned before Pesach. Beit Hillel say no, it's like Maaser Sheni. It's like the second tithe entirely. One has to add the 5th and also has to destroy it before Pesach. Beit Shammai omrim yesh lo feret v'yesh lo o lilot. What was I going to say? It is also subject to the law of fallen grapes and to the law of gleanings. V'haniyim podim la'atzman u'Beit Hillel omrim kulo lagat. So actually, Beit Hillel also think that it needs to entirely be eaten in a certain fashion, like Maaser Sheni, whereas Beit Shammai say since it's not exactly like Maser Sheni, some of it actually does go to the poor. It is a little bit different. It actually still has some of the usual kind of categories or kind of practices of siphoning off some of the produce for the poor that we might have with other kinds of produce from other years does apply this as well. So it isn't exactly like Maser Sheni, and because of all that, it's considered to be a leniency of HMI instead of Beit Hillel. So a lot of produce stuff. What else do we get in these disagreements so far? We got also specifically things having to do with Yom Tov, specifically things having to do, primarily Yom Tov so far, Pesach, and issues of tithes. And think about that also as you go on with the chapter, right? Like what other topics do we see them agreeing and disagreeing about here, and specifically the Beit Shammai is more lenient about? If you can, I'll talk about this also once we finish this whole chapter. Think about like, well, what is there possibly a general principle here that might be governing what leads Beit Shammai to be more lenient in these cases over Beit Hillel, or is it just kind of totally random? Is there some method to the madness, or is it really just kind of somewhat associative and piece by piece? Okay, so we saw chapter 3 overall and also somewhat in depth by comparing it to other passages, and established that the material that's parallel between chapter 3 in Eduyot and is also found in other tractates seems to be unique to Tractate Eduyot. And we could ask the same question here, as we will later, concerning the leniencies of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. But for now, I'm done with this material, and I could we'll say more next week, but I'm also happy to take questions if there are any questions.
So far, no questions in chat, but I'm happy that people are always welcome to unmute themselves and ask questions.
Great.
And if people don't have questions, and I want to remind people about a scheduling note, the last question session of this class is on April 15th. This is during Chol HaMoed Pesach, so please keep in mind that even though most Drisha classes are pausing over Pesach and resuming after Pesach for Sfiras Zman, this class is not.
Mm-hmm. Looking forward to that one too. Yeah, so next week and the week after that, and then on the 5th and the 14th, I guess also we'll be finishing the Tractate, so that's the final class.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
All right, and thank you everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to have a class live after the past 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And I hope to see as many people as possible in the following week.
Great. Thanks so much, Taylor.
Take care, everyone, and be well.